Hello, my fellow readers. This is iDarkSymphony777. Welcome to another fanfiction reading. As always, a link to the story will be in the description below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell for notifications, leave a comment in the comment section below on your thoughts on the story. Finally, listen to my opinion. My opinion is not indicative of everyone in the world, so please respect that. So, the story I'm doing a reading of is How to Tame a Wolf by June Ellie. It is a time crisis story, and I'm going to be honest. I know of Time Crisis. I played a lot of Time Crisis when I went to arcades. I didn't know they had lore. Huh. Learn something new. Let's get started. 1996. Even as he approached the hotel room, Richard wasn't quite sure why he was there. He had succeeded in his mission and submitted his report to VSSE. He should have been heading off into the sunset, waiting until the VSSE called him in for a new assignment. Sticking around in the afternoon, a mission simply wasn't his style. Hesitating, Richard lingered outside the hotel room for a moment before gathering his courage and going in. The young lady lying on the bed looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, you're the man who rescued me. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name." "Afraid. Miller." "Richard Miller," he replied inadvertently. His gaze was drawn to her right arm, which was heavily bandaged and in a sling. "Thank you for saving me, Agent Miller." Rachel gave him a small smile. A flash of guilt shot through him. "Please, don't take me, Miss McPherson," he muttered, averting his gaze. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop you from getting shot." To his surprise, she laughed. "Please, just call me Rachel. And all things considered, I think getting shot in the arm is probably better than being killed. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have left that castle alive." Richard didn't know what to say in response, so he changed the subject. "How long will you be staying here?" "They'll probably let me leave at the end of the week. Aside from my arm, the doctors want to be sure my captors didn't do anything funny to me." She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "What about you? Where will you go?" Richard opened his mouth to answer, then realized he didn't know what he was going to say. Usually he would be long gone by now, roaming the country as he pleased, with nobody to take his path. But the idea of leaving Rachel alone to recover from her injury, which he was partly at fault for, treacherous voice at the back of his mind whispered, didn't sit well for him. "I'm not sure," he finally replied. "Well," Rachel looked at him, a shy yet impish smile tugging at her lips. "If you don't have any other plans, perhaps you can keep me company while I'm here. The hospital isn't a particularly interesting place." Richard gave her a contemplative look. Although he usually preferred his own company, he had never disliked people. Instead, he found it rather pleasant to be near other people, but not with them, watching the flow and ebb of life around him from a distance. Perhaps it was his lingering guilt, or perhaps he was just in a melancholic mood. Either way, the idea of actually spending some time with another person for once seemed oddly pleasant. "Perhaps I will," Richard said at last, gracing Rachel with an awkward smile. As her eyes lit up at his response, Richard found himself looking forward to the upcoming week. Over the next week, Richard returned to the hospital every day to visit Rachel. Aside from her father, Rachel had not had any other visitors besides Richard, since the VSSE and the Circean government were hoping to keep the entire incident under wraps as much as possible. There was an underlying sadness to her gentle demeanor, and Richard would have been completely blind to not realize she was lonely. No, Richard was not particularly good at comforting others. His presence seemed to lift Rachel's spirits. He didn't speak much, but she didn't seem to mind. Relishing in the quiet yet intense way, Richard listened as she spoke. On his part, Richard found listening to Rachel both enjoyable and refreshing. Despite her soft-spoken and seemingly shy demeanor, there was a fierce edge to her words, and her eyes shone with conviction. He learned that she was in a biochemistry major in an American university, that her roommate Sophie was her best friend, and that even though she was in training combat, Rachel was a fighter in spirit. So much we could do if we actually tried to help people. "I don't want to just work for a private firm that's going to prioritize making money," Rachel said in a soft but firm voice. "I may not be a fighter by you, but I want to do what I can to make a difference." Richard looked at her in surprise. Most people chose to just keep their heads down and go about their own business, leaving it to someone else to fix the world. Yet, even after she had been pulled into danger and barely escaped, Rachel still wanted to fight back in her own way. "I wish there were more people like you," Richard said quietly. "If there were, people like me wouldn't be needed." Rachel blushed slightly at Richard's words, giving a small smile. "It's very kind of you, Agent Miller." "I would say so if I didn't mean it," Richard replied. He hesitated for a moment, then added, Call me Richard. Like, Rachel's expression changed to surprise, pleasure. Her smile grew wider. All right, Richard. Richard felt unexpected warmth inside of him at the sight, and he faintly wished he had more opportunities to put a smile on Richard's face. Cursing himself, he quickly banished the thought, reminding himself that such sentiments were inappropriate and probably unappreciated. Thank you for your company, Richard. I had fun this week. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts, startling him slightly. Why, do you think there's a chance we might see each other someday? The rational part of his mind wanted to say no. He had already lingered too long, and it was risky forming attachment in his line of work, especially with his nomadic lifestyle. The selfish part of his mind hesitated, quietly noting that he had actually enjoyed spending time with Rachel. It would be nice if he could do so again in the future. I don't know, he finally responded. But I wouldn't be opposed to the idea. Well, as long as there's a chance, anything can happen, right? There was a teasing lip to Rachel's reply, and Richard blinked as she gave him a mischievous smile. After a moment, he gave her a smile in return. I guess you're right. Despite the tentative connection he formed with Rachel, Richard went back to his nomadic ways after Rachel was released from the hospital and returned to university. He soon got back into the swing of things, and the Circia incident and its aftermath became just another footnote in his memory. A part of him regretted losing the first genuine connection he had with another person in a while. But for the most part, Richard was the same free spirit he had always been. 3 months later, Richard slipped through the crowd as he headed down the street, lost in his thoughts. Although he was allowed to operate with an unprecedented level of autonomy, the VSSE still required him to physically report in occasionally. After returning to HQ for the first time in months and briefly meeting with the director, Richard was ready to put New York behind him and head out again. Admittedly, his conversation with the director had been interesting. In light of the Circia incident, the director was considering forming an elite division of VSSE agents to handle urgent large-scale threats. Although Richard would have been able to handle the situation effectively by himself, he couldn't be everywhere at once. A task force for dealing with potentially world-ending crises would hopefully enable the VSSE to deal with any further incidents more smoothly. It was a sound idea in theory, but Richard wondered if screening the regular agents would actually yield any candidates with potential. Suppose there might be a few promising agents among them. Not like I know any of them well enough to know for certain. Still mulling over his discussion, Richard nearly collided with a young woman walking in the opposite direction from him. Sorry, Miss E quickly apologized, stepping to the side. Richard? The familiar voice caught his attention, and he quickly turned to look at the woman in surprise. Rachel, what are you doing here? Richard gave Rachel a quick glance over, relieved to see that she didn't appear to have suffered any lasting damage from her stint as a hostage. I just graduated last month, she replied. My friends and I are taking a trip together, but everyone's doing their own thing for today. What about you? I guess you're doing something work-related at the moment. Something like that, Richard sidestepped the question. I'm done for now, though. Rachel's eyes lit up. Really? If that's the case, would you like to grab some coffee? Sorry? Richard blinked at her surprise. Rachel gave an impish smile. It's been a while. It'd be nice to catch up. Free. Richard hesitated, looking carefully at Rachel. Her eyes gleamed with hope, and he could hear the unspoken invitation in her words. I'm sorry. I don't think that would be wise. The words spilled forth from his mouth before he could stop himself. Rachel's gay face fell slightly. Sorry, did I say something wrong? Instantly regretting his hasty response, Richard shook his head. No, it's not that. I just... He sighed. Look, Rachel, you should forget about me. You deserve to be happy and safe. Getting involved with me in any way is only going to put you in danger again. Rachel gave him a wide look as she let out a mirthless laugh. Perhaps you've forgotten, but I was in danger before we even met. I'm not as fragile as you think I am, Agent Miller. Still, you deserve better, Richard insisted. Someone younger and more stable, not someone who's constantly on the move. She held up a hand to stop him. Look, Richard, if you're not genuinely interested, I'll respect that and back off. But if you're trying to scare me away, it's not going to work. I know it might not work out. I'm willing to take that risk anyway. Richard swallowed, looking Rachel in the eye. I can't make any promises. I'm not asking for any, she replied firmly. We can take it slowly, see how things turn out. What do you say? Richard was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, with a hint of nervousness. There's a diner. a few blocks from here. Grab a bite there. We have someplace else in mind. Rachel's face lit up with a smile. That sounds perfect. Navigating a long distance relationship was tricky at the best of times. With Richard's nomadic lifestyle and his work as a VSSE agent, tricky became a massive understatement. Despite the spark of mutual attraction between them, he and Rachel decided against jumping the gun and rushing into a relationship they were ill prepared for. Instead, they agreed to just be friends for the time being and see whether their interest in each other remained alive, and after being tested by the circumstances involved. Months passed, and life went on. Two regular VSSE agents have been chosen to join the new Crisis Agents Division after their exemplary performance on the screening test. A daredevil adrenaline... I mispronounced adrenaline. A daredevil adrenaline junkie named Keith Martin, and a straight-laced agent named Robert Baxter, which I think are the main characters of the first time Crisis. I think. Like I said, I wasn't even aware that there was actual strip lore in this game. Although they had potential, the agents could not hope to match Richard's skill, so deploying them in the same manner as Richard was out. In theory, pairing them up was a logical and tactically sound decision. In practice, the agents seemed to be constantly at each other's throats throughout training. Although they were competent individually, it seemed that their partnership was doomed to fail, and many of the other VSSE personnel were taking bets on how long it would take for them to kill each other. Richard learned the basis of the situation when the director contacted him for another mission. The rest of the details were from office gossip, passed on by Rachel, who had been recruited by the VSSE as a scientist. You're working for us? Richard had been surprised, to say the least. Why so surprised? Even through the phone, he could hear Rachel's voice. I told you I want to do something meaningful. I can't fight. I can still help in my own way. For everything, she's still running towards danger. You're not like most people, are you? Richard let out a laugh. Congratulations, Rachel. I'm sure you do great. Thanks, Richard. There was a small pause. Then Rachel asked, "Will you be back anytime soon?" I'm not sure. Richard admitted quietly. There was a moment of silence, and Richard felt a pang of guilt as he imagined the disappointment Rachel was struggling to conceal at his lackluster response. All right, she finally answered in a would-be casual tone that fooled neither of them. Hopefully I'll catch you next time you report back here. Richard swallowed painfully, torn between wanting to apologize and staying silent. In the end, he settled on telling Rachel to take care of herself before hanging up. Though Richard roamed far and wide in between missions, never staying in the same place for long, there were a few constants in his life. One was his mission briefings from the VSSE, another was his pride and joy, the red sports car which brought him all over the country. The last was the communication with Rachel. He and Rachel emailed regularly, and they talked on the phone at the end of each month. Rachel always sounded eager to hear what Richard had been up to, though he couldn't talk much about his assignments. He often spoke of the places he visited and the people he saw around him. Almost without realizing it, he had become looking forward to his conversations with Rachel. He had become as much a part of his life as his nomadic ways. Despite that, he found that he still couldn't bring himself to choose between the freedom he craved and the woman he was slowly beginning to fall for. He cared about Rachel, but the thought of giving up his nomadic lifestyle and settling down in one place still filled him with a sense of dread. Even as he continued to maintain a delicate balancing act between his conflicting desires, a small part of him knew that he couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, Richard would have to decide which was more important to him. Time continued to march on. Keith and Robert had apparently come to an understanding and settled into a solid partnership, albeit one with plenty of amicable bickering. Why the hell was I trying to say building? I don't know. The VSSE had decided to add a residential ring to headquarters, since the crisis agents had to be called in on a moment's notice if the situation broke out in the middle of the night. Richard still couldn't bring himself to choose between Rachel and his desire for freedom. Though Rachel didn't press him on the issue, there was a palpable tension growing steadily between them with each conversation they had. The uneasy equilibrium grew shakier with each passing day, but it somehow continued to hold. Before he knew it, 1997 had arrived, and with it, an incident that changed everything. It should have been a simple assignment. The VSSE had uncovered some intel about Wild Dog Associates, a woman referred to as Cantaris, I think that's how it's pronounced, was said to be Wild Dog's arms supplier, and the VSSE had managed to pinpoint her base of operations. Richard was ordered to infiltrate the hotel, which served as a front of for a weapons factory and shut down her business. At first, it seemed as though things were going smoothly. Well, as smoothly as his missions ever went, at any rate. Richard made his way through the hotel, fighting off Kentaris' subordinates and chasing after her as she fled further in the factory, finally cornering her at the heliport of the roof. Perhaps Richard was distracted by his subconscious worries about the situation with Rachel. Perhaps it was just plain bad luck. Either way, he was unable to shoot down Kentaris' gunship in time. She escaped with her surviving men, and Richard could do nothing but swear as the gunship flew out of range and vanished into the distance. Given the circumstances, Richard returned to VSSE headquarters to report his failure in person. The director was displeased, to say the least. Agent Miller, I'm disappointed. It's not like you to make a mistake like this. What happened? Richard remained silent, averting his gaze. Why am I saying glaze? There was nothing he could say to defend himself. After all, the director was right. He had messed up, and now Kentaris was at large. Do you have anything to say for yourself? I have no excuse for my failure, sir, Richard finally answered. I take full responsibility for what happened, and I will accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. The director looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Richard, you've been a good agent until now. You've been given a considerable amount of freedom to operate independently as a result. But I'm afraid that in light of what's happened, we're going to have to rein you in somewhat. Richard swallowed, feeling a tendril of dread creeping up his spine. You'll be on probation for a few months, during which point you'll be expected to stay in headquarters with the other crisis agents to train and work. To that, I know you dislike being chased down, so I won't force you to stay here on a full-time basis. However, you will stay in headquarters for 6 months at a time. You can spend the remaining half of the year to continue the travel between missions, as you have been until now. Clamping down the surge of panic that shot through him, Richard nodded, struggling to keep his expression blank. Yes, sir. As he left the room, he could almost feel the walls closing on him. Mocking him reminded him that his freedom has finally slipped from his grasp. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the whispers of the other VSSC personnel as he spotted the legendary yet elusive agent Richard Miller actually gracing the quarters of HQ for once. Richard, a worried yet familiar voice, broke through his thoughts. He turned, already knowing who he would see standing there. Rachel, shouldn't you be working by now? It's my lunch break, she replied softly. I heard about Kentaris. See, he said he dropped his gauge, too ashamed to meet her eyes. Rachel gently placed a hand on his shoulder. How are you holding up? Richard hesitated, not used to bearing his souls to others. But this was Rachel. He trusted her to listen and not judge him. Furious at myself for messing up like this. Richard admitted. I'm not usually this careless. I don't know what went wrong in my head during the mission. Rachel said nothing but squeezed his shoulder comfortably. Richard swallowed, feeling a slight wetness to his eyes, accompanied by another surge of shame at his loss of control. What's going to happen to you? Rachel finally asked. I'm on probation for the time being. I have to spend more time staying around HQ in the future. Rachel was kind enough to not comment on the bitter undertone of Richard's response. When's the last time you ate? She asked instead. Richard blinked, nonplussed by the abrupt change of subject. Why? There's a cafe nearby that's pretty good. Grab a bite there, she paused, giving him a look. Unless you want to rather eat in the cafeteria, I don't think they're in the mood to have people staring at you at the moment. Richard felt a surge of gratitude at Rachel's perceptiveness. I would like that. If you don't have any other plans, I'll lead the way. Over the next few weeks, Richard began to settle into VSSE headquarters. He moved into an apartment in the residential ring, though it ended up being sparsely furnished since he didn't have much to fill it with. At the same time, he finally met Keith and Robert, who seemed in awe of his reputation. In spite of his initial reservations, Richard found himself impressed. They were still inexperienced, but they clearly had potential to become exemplary crisis agents. Richard spent his time working in the crisis agent's office, and his off days honing his skills in the training room to guard against a repeat of the Kentaris incident. The novelty of seeing him around headquarters eventually began to wear off, and the other VSSE personnel whispers around him gradually lessened. It took some time, but the sting of shame at his failure slowly began to fade, replaced by a determination to do better in the future. Yet at the same time, he grew steadily more frustrated by the restrictions placed upon him. He longed to escape from the confines of headquarters and return to the open road that still called to him. At first, Rachel, who had taken to eating lunch with him from time to time, stayed silent in the face of his obvious frustrations. However, after a month of Richard going more and more morose, she couldn't hold her tongue any longer. Richard. Rachel, Rachel entered the agent office, where Richard was finishing off some paperwork. Without looking up, he replied, Give me 5 minutes to finish up here. I need to speak to you, she said firmly, sounding more serious than he ever heard. Richard looked up to her in surprise. What is it? We need to talk. About us. Richard stared at her for a moment, then gestured to a nearby chair. Richard took a seat, looking Richard in the eye. Richard, I know you've been unhappy recently, being struck by headquarters against your wishes, but I was hoping that perhaps, despite the situation, you might find something worth staying for. Richard's eyes widened and he swallowed, unsure what to say in response. Rachel clasped her hands together, looking as though she was steeling herself to say something unpleasant. Look, Richard, I care about you, and I hope it's not too presumptuous to believe that you care about me too, in your own way. But I need to know where we stand. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I won't ask you to stop leaving entirely. But if what we have is enough incentive for you to at least stay around for a while, then I think I deserve to know. Richard was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. Sorry. Rachel's face fell and she stood up, blinking back tears forming in her eyes. Hastily, she turned away, not wanting Richard to see her getting upset. I guess I should have expected that. Thanks for being honest. At least. Wait! Richard got to his feet and placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. She tensed up, but didn't push him away. It's not what I meant. Sorry I've been taking you for granted. Rachel turned to look at Richard, blinking in surprise. Richard ran a hand through his hair, letting out a breath. You're completely right. It isn't fair to expect you to keep waiting forever for someone who refuses to even make a compromise for your sake. If you're so willing, if it's not too late, I'd like to change that. Rachel swallowed, looking at him uncertainly. I don't want to pressure you into doing something you don't want to do. I know you hate being chained down, and I won't force you to be stuck with me because you feel guilty. Richard shook his head. This is something I want. I've been afraid of sacrificing my freedom for anything, but I've forgotten that some things are worth the sacrifice. The tears finally began to flow, but this time they were tears of relief. Rachel threw her arms around Richard and he slowly returned her hug, holding her as she tried to compose herself. At length, she pulled away, wiping her eyes. I'm not expecting you to settle down completely. I know you're too restless for that, and I won't ask that of you. But I'm just glad I get to spend more time with you. At least for a while. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Richard asked. Rachel blinked, then gave him a small smile. I'd be delighted. Where are we going? Are you alright with coming over to my apartment? I was thinking of cooking us something. Your apartment? Rachel sounded surprised. Richard smirked. Don't worry, we'll just be having dinner. I won't ask you to stay the night at this stage. Too early for that. Rachel rolled her eyes, jokingly punching him on the shoulder. It's not what I meant. I didn't realize you could cook. What? Thought I ate out all the time? I cook myself tired often when I'm in the mood. Richard replied. It's like to eat a home cooked meal sometimes after all. In that case, I wouldn't mind. Am I allowed to visit your apartment, though? What do you mean? Richard frowned. Well, the residential arena is supposed to be for crisis agents only, she pointed out. Should be fine. You work for the VSSE, not like you're a complete outsider. Doubt anyone will mind. Alright. But if you're getting any more trouble, don't say I didn't warn you, Rachel teased. I think the director has bigger things to worry about who I'm dating, Richard retorted sarcastically. Rachel flushed slightly, feeling a sudden warmth inside at Richard's words. They had been dancing around the specifics of the relationship the whole time, and hearing him directly say that they were dating sent a thrill of pleasure through her. Forward to tonight, then, she responded, flashing him a huge smile. It wasn't easy at first. Richard was still unused to staying in the same place for so long, and it took him some time to adjust to the idea. Despite his trepidation, he was adamant that he wanted to make the relationship work. On her part, Rachel was patient with him, understanding that he was trying his best. She didn't push him, allowing him to adjust at his own pace. Dinner at Richard's apartment became a semi-regular affair. Rachel asked him about his cooking skills once, after jokingly admitted she nearly set the kitchen on fire after trying to make toast back in university. Richard went quiet for a moment before telling her about how his mother had raised him by himself. He had grown up eating her cooking, and she taught him the basics. After she had fallen sick, Richard had cooked for both of them, until her illness worsened and she was hospitalized. She passed away when Richard was 18, leaving him all alone. Listening to Richard's story, Rachel understood all at once why he was constantly on the move. Having been alone for so long, Richard found stability in an alien concept. He was more used to his own company than being around others, and the open road gave him the freedom to be away from them as he pleased. She didn't say any of this out loud, merely gave Richard a hug and kissed him gently. That night, she spent the night with him for the first time. Time slipped in the blink of an eye. Richard slowly grew used to being around headquarters during his mandatory stays. His apartment remained mostly bare, but he slowly added small touches to it whenever he was back at headquarters, and it almost started to look live-in. Over time, he formed a tentative working relationship with Keith and Robert. Though the younger agents never quite stopped being in awe of him, they eventually began to interact with him on a mostly equal level. On his part, he found himself starting to grow fond of them in a distant way. When VSSE intelligence officer Christy Ryan was captured during an undercover operation in 1998, Keith and Robert were sent to rescue her. It was apparent how far they come from their initial antagonistic relationship, with the partners working together smoothly to not only rescue Christy, but also to prevent the launch of a nuclear satellite. Richard secretly felt proud of their success, and he would never admit that to them. Two new agents, Alan Dunaway and Wesley Lambert, joined the VSSE the following year. Unlike Keith and Robert, Alan and Wesley were recruited directly as crisis agents, and they had already been friends beforehand. They seemed inseparable, with a much more lighthearted and easygoing relationship than Keith and Robert. However, like Keith and Robert, they too held Richard in high regard on account of his reputation. Seemed rather nervous around him as a result. Though they weren't particularly close to him, Richard found himself going to care for them as well. After the initial hiccups, his relationship with Rachel has blossomed. Although Rachel still had her own apartment outside of VSSE HQ, she ended up staying with him more often than not while he was back at headquarters. Work came first for both of them, but they agreed to try and make time for each other no matter how busy they became. Richard had grown used to having a place to return to after months of traveling, especially with someone waiting there for him. Still, he would occasionally grow melancholic while staying at headquarters. When that happened, Rachel simply held him tighter, wordlessly grounding him and letting her presence wash away his lingering restlessness. For a time, it seemed as though nothing could ruin the happiness they'd found. Then 2001 rolled around. Richard didn't know which deity was watching over him, but he was forever grateful that he decided to turn on the television in the motel room and have a look that evening. It was like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. President Xavier Serrano of Caruba had been assassinated on live television by someone who looked exactly like Richard. Naturally, the VSSE was ordered to disavow Richard and hunt him down. Fortunately, the director gave him the benefit of the doubt, allowing him 40 hours to clear his name before the VSSE would have no choice but to send agents after him. The VSSE couldn't officially give him any assistance. However, they did pass on the coordinates of a ship supposedly belonging to Kintaris, the arms dealer who he had failed to capture 4 years ago. An informant came. God, why am I messing up this so bad? An informant codenamed Abacus was being held captive on the ship, and she apparently had a possible lead on the real killer. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. With nothing more than the VSSE could offer him, Richard was cast adrift to fend for himself. And so began the longest 48 hours of his life. Richard managed to breach the cruise ship and find Abacus, who turned out to be a young woman named Marissa Soleil. Marissa told him that a Caruban mercenary named Ricardo Blanco. Really? That's the guy's name? Ricardo Blanco. God damn it. That's so goofy. Had carried out the assassination in disguise as Richard. Unfortunately, Kintaris managed to escape again before Richard had a chance to subdue her, although admittedly he had bigger problems to worry about than Kintaris at that moment. After a series of misadventures, Richard managed to make it to Ricardo Blanco's mansion and track down his doppelganger, subduing him after an intense firefight. Unfortunately, his relief was short-lived, as an apparently still alive wild dog gunned Blanco down before Richard's eyes, robbing his last chance at clearing his name. Furious at Wild Dog's treachery, Blanco told Richard to find Wild Dog at his lab on the island Rio Oro before bleeding out. It took a long while for Richard to find the island and make his way there. All the while, he felt an uncharacteristic sense of dread enveloping him. At first, he wasn't quite sure why. Sure, it was a great situation, and he had a personal stake in it at this time, but he had been in dangerous situations before, and he'd always been able to keep his cool under pressure. Then it occurred to him. He was afraid, not of dying, but of the consequences of failing. He feared what would happen if he was unable to clear his name and return home. As much as he enjoyed his nomadic ways, the thought of spending the rest of his life being hunted by the authorities, constantly on the run and having to look over his shoulder whenever he went, even a lone wolf like him would be able to find a painfully lonely way to live. Wild Dog's lab on Rio Oro was his only hope. If he couldn't find something there that proved his innocence, he would never be able to see Rachel again. He would be forced to break his promise to her and leave, never to return. The only woman he had ever been willing to put aside his freedom for would be separated from him forever. Yet he realized it wasn't just Rachel he would miss. If he failed, he wouldn't be able to spend his days at VSSE HQ, quietly watching as Keith and Robert bickered while Alan and Wesley joked around. In spite of himself, he realized that he grown to care for all of them all along. The thought of never being able to see any of them made his heart ache painfully. With a maelstrom of thoughts swirling around his mind, Richard found himself counting down the hours until he reached Rio Oro, silently begging whatever deity might be listening to let them be some evidence in the lab. Apparently, the gods were looking down quite favorably after all. Fighting his way through the lab, he unexpectedly came face to face with the very much alive President Serrano, promising to contact the VSSE and clear Richard's name. Serrano warned him of Project Titan, Wild Dog's latest plan. The madman planned to unleash a titanium robot army on the world, and he was on the verge of success. With no time to waste, Richard headed off in pursuit of Wild Dog to put an end to his mad scheme. He managed to track down Wild Dog at the latter's lair after fighting his way through a horde of enemies. Wild Dog was apparently smarter than Richard had given him credit for. After an intense shootout, he attempted to make his escape via helicopter while preparing to launch the robot army remotely. Richard felt a sort of panic as the outcome of the Cantaris incident seemed to be repeating itself before his very eyes. Sealing himself, he took a deep breath and fired off 2 shots at Wild Dog's escaping helicopter. As the sun rose on the second morning since Richard was framed, Wild Dog helicopter careened out of control, crashing into the chamber containing his robot army. The subsequent explosion consumed Wild Dog and destroyed the robots, putting an end to Project Titan. Richard privately doubted that Wild Dog was really dead, but he didn't have a chance to confirm his launch as he was forced to flee the fortress before it collapsed and buried him under the rubble. Once he made it safely to the speedboat, he almost collapsed in relief. It was finally over. He can go home. It wasn't quite the end, of course. Richard managed to make it back to Rio Oro to retrieve President Serrano and bring him back to Caruba. The Caruban government's reaction to finding their supposedly dead president being escorted by a supposed assassin had been interesting, to say the least. It took a while to sort everything out, but with President Serrano vouching for Richard and revealing what had really happened, Richard was finally in the clear. The Caruban government rescinded the demand for the VSSE to hunt him down and offered him an official apology. President Serrano invited him to the award ceremony that evening, wanting to thank him for his actions. However, Richard had been on the run for almost 2 days with no sleep. At this point, he was frankly exhausted, and all he really wanted was to go home. Besides, he still had something important to take care of. The halls of VSSE headquarters were abuzz with gossip for the 3rd day in a row. Everyone heard about the legendary agent Richard Miller supposedly assassinating the president of Caruba, and the rumors had been flying thick and fast. Now that Richard's name had been cleared, he had apparently vanished from Caruba without a trace, and everyone was wondering where he went. At that moment, the answer came as the agent himself entered headquarters, looking tired yet determined. Ignoring the whispers that broke out of his appearance, he made a beeline for the director's office and entered without knocking, shutting the door behind him. Agent Miller! Welcome back! There was a hint of surprise in the director's tone as Richard entered the room. Thank you, sir, Richard said quietly. I believe President Serrano was rather disappointed by your absence, the director added dryly. To his credit, Richard looked somewhat contrite. Please convey my apologies to him, but what happens over the last few days, I honestly wasn't in the mood to deal with anything that else required me in an official capacity. I guess much. There was a pause as the director looked over at Richard, taking in his exhausted countenance. To what do I owe the pleasure of your presence? His calm voice carried an undertone of concern to it. Richard swallowed, looking uncharacteristically nervous. I had a request, actually. Is that so? Go on. Would it be possible for me to move into the headquarters on a permanent basis? There was another pause. If he didn't know better, Richard would have believed he managed to surprise the director. This is something unexpected, Agent Miller. But I don't welcome. Who brought this on? After what just happened, being on my own doesn't really seem as quite as appealing as it once did, Richard admitted quietly. If that's the case, then you're more welcome to stay here, the director responded, a slight smile gracing his face. Thank you, sir. There's one more thing. Richard hesitated slightly, looking unsure of himself. What is it? Would it be possible for someone other than the crisis agents to take up residence in the headquarters as well? The director gave him a long, contemplative look. Richard barely managed to refrain from fidgeting as he waited. I assume you're referring to Miss McPherson, he replied as last. Normally, such a request would be impossible. However, given her history with us and the fact that she now worked for us, allow it. Surge of relief flooded through him. Thank you very much, sir. As he turned to leave, the director stopped him. Richard? Richard turned back around. Yes, sir. There was an uncharacteristic softness to the director's expression. Home. Richard swallowed, feeling a slight wetness to his eyes. Thank you, sir. Richard! Almost as soon as he left the director's office, Richard heard the one voice he'd been longing to hear. Turning, he lunged forward and enveloped Rachel in a tight hug, which she godly returned. I was so worried. Everyone was talking about what happened. I was afraid I would never see you again. Her voice was trembling, and she sounded on the verge of tears. I miss you too, Richard said hoarsely, feeling something wet trickling down his cheeks. I'm so glad I was able to come home. They stayed like that for a few more minutes, basking in each other's presence. Finally, Richard pulled away. Glad you're here. I want to talk to you about something. What is it? Moving into the HQ permanently. Rachel's eyes widened. What? I thought you didn't want to settle down. I think I already did. And just hasn't realized it. Richard admitted. While I was on the run, I found myself missing the VSSE. I was afraid I'd never get to see any other agents again. Richard. Rachel squeezed his hand gently, giving him a small smile. There's one other thing, Richard swallowed, and looked Rachel firmly in the eye. I realized that I can't bear to leave you again, Rachel. Will you marry me? What? Rachel gasped in surprise. I want to wake up next to you every morning and be by your side always. I'm sorry. This was a spontaneous thing and I couldn't bear to wait. So I don't have a ring yet, but Rachel interrupted Richard at the moment, giving a long, sweet kiss. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were shining, and the wide smile on her face could have put the Mona Lisa to shame. Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you so much, Richard. Love you too, Rachel. Never want to lose you again. Dim part of his mind told him he was grinning like an idiot, but he was too deliriously happy to care. So I guess we're stuck with each other then, Rachel said teasingly. As Richard took her hand, his heart felt lighter than it had ever been. Nothing would ever make me happier than that. So that is How to Tame a Wolf. Honestly, it's really fun. It's a really good story. There's no grammar errors. I think the plot for how short it was paced perfectly. The characters were there. There's quite literally nothing. There's no criticism I can have for this story. It's a 5 out of 5. I honestly wish I had more to say about this because it's like usually with these short stories is like, oh, I can make like a joke or anything, but no, this is just a genuinely just a really solid no frill story. So kudos to the author for this. That's really well done. This has been Dark Symphony 777 and cut.